At the altar, the room held its breath, until he chose the wrong woman. Strings shivered, glasses trembled on mirrored trays. Hundreds of camera phones turned into a single bright, pulsating lens aimed at the same impossible moment. Michael Jones, in a tux that caught the light like an armor, stepping away from the woman who had been walking toward him down the aisle, and toward Lena, a courier who had been hired that morning to deliver a forgotten tie. For a second, it looked like a movie cut gone live. The bride, her name a hush now swallowed by the chorus of lenses, stumbled on the carpet as 1,000 whispers became a roar. Guests blinked as if someone had asked them to decide, in a breath, which of two stories they would carry home. The band stopped mid-measure. Someone's champagne cork popped and rolled like a tumbling thought. Lena felt the world reduce itself to a single bead at her throat. The pendant the bakery woman had tied around her with flour-dusted fingers and a smile, no more than a small, aged oval on a narrow chain, caught the light and threw it back, stubborn and bright. A trinket, she had insisted when she pressed it into Lena's hands a week before. Keep it, the woman had said. Some things find the right person at odd times. It was the pendant, not the man, that focused everyone. Reporters leaned forward instinctively, hunters smelling feed. The pendant was a private object rendered public in a loud room, a talisman turned headline. Michael's face, somewhere between triumph and something that looked nearly like fear, refused to let the moment be simple. For a man who cultivated control, the theater was his instrument. Tonight, he used it as a blade. Photographs would later show his mouth shaped into words not heard by everyone at once. She's the one. The bride's silence became a visible thing, a red smear on a white dress, a hand clutched to a throat as if to hold steady against a fall. Guests rose in a chaotic wave, as if pushed from the back of an audience. Some left, others stayed, transfixed. Social media birthed its own weather. GIFs, live streams, breathless commentary. The phrase "wrong woman" trended before the band resumed, playing a charity version of Calm. A man in a gray suit, Sharon, power in built shoulders and watch faces, crossed to Lena before anyone could think to protect her. His smile was flat as a threat. Beside him, Cade Marrow, whose sharp jaw had made him the kind of fixer executives call at 2 in the morning, kept his eyes on the pendant. They were men used to transactions that went quiet. They expected this to be another thing they could tidy. "This is a private matter," Cade said, his voice a cultivated neutral. It sounded like a command disguised as a suggestion. Lena, smelling sugar and fret and old wood, heard herself say nothing for a moment. The pendant thudded gently against the hollow at the base of her throat. She had not been invited to this life. She had been hired to run one small errand. She had not imagined anyone would notice the little oval inscribed with a looping E. She had not imagined anyone would think a flour-dusted woman's trinket could carry more than a story. Yet, if there is one thing she had learned from jobs, understands really, it was that small details mattered. A missent label, a misread address, a stamp placed the wrong way. Those were the things that became mistakes and then catastrophes. She had learned to keep receipts, to photograph a locked parcel, to note the time. That habit now lived under her skin like a quiet tally. They led her away from the ballroom under the pretext of privacy. The side room smelled of lemon polish and hushed power. Men in suits closed the door. Cameras framed the windows beyond them like judgment. Cade's assistant produced a small leather folder. 3 pages, a polite form, the kind of thing executed when one wanted a problem dissolved rather than litigated. Beneath those papers lay an offer and a gag. Sign an NDA, accept a quiet payment, and step back into the life that had been her life. "We can make this disappear," the assistant said softly, "for everyone's sake.
Lena's fingers tightened around the chain. She did not trust easy solutions. Not because she was brave, at least not only because of that, but because the pendant had a way of being more than it looked. It had been given with a breathless confession in the warm back room of the bakery, where the woman with flower on her sleeves had said, "It's not for you to wear for attention. It will keep the right papers together when the time comes." "You can't buy me," Lena said, and the sentence sounded small and ugly in the pasteurized light of the side room. She had no idea how she knew to say it, only that she did. "I don't want your money. I want the truth." That was when one of them, Sharon, or the man they called Sheeran in the private conversations that floated like dark birds across Michael's orbit, put down the folder and smiled as if he had always expected this. "Be reasonable, Lena," he said. "We are offering you something that keeps you safe. Think of it as stability. We can set you up. A place, a sum. You won't have to work another day." She thought of the bakery woman's hands, dusted with flour, the way she had pressed the oval into Lena's palm like a secret. She thought of the battered notebook she kept in her small rented room, the cheap spiral edges pointing like teeth, full of delivery notes, times, names of people who had once trusted her to deliver something unremarkable. The notebook had blank places she had filled in with small sentences of her own history. Mother, hospital, no visitors allowed. Apartment, 3rd floor, no elevator. She had the USB, too, tucked beneath the notebook, not carefully kept, but kept because once, months ago, an old woman had handed her papers and said, "For when you need to prove you remember people." When Sharon offered silence, he offered a narrative. Accept a new story as your past. He would buy the old pages and replace them. Lena touched the pendant and felt the old woman's whisper in her bones. She felt also the ledger habit, the record-keeping reflex. If something matters, leave a trail. Word of what had happened in the side room leaked into the ballroom like a slow incense. Someone posted a photo of Lena's hand with the pendant held limp against a page of the program. Caption: "Wedding chaos, mysterious courier steals the show." The scarfed consultant arrived within an hour. He wore his scarf like a credential. His name was unknown to most, but not to those who hawked speed and certainty. He brought a small case and an offer that was all certainty and light. A lab could analyze the metal in minutes, confirm or deny any claim about origin. He spoke of tests, fast, irrefutable, delivered to reporters in friendly, bite-sized PR-friendly language. Cade's people moved to neutralize the story with speed. They issued an early statement. The groom had made a spontaneous choice in a moment of personal truth. The rest of the night was a private family matter. But their spokesmen were not only men in dark rooms issuing statements, they were men who sent lab reports to certain editors with a friendly note, a preliminary analysis from a network of partners that could be trusted. Authenticity issues, the note said, inconclusive markers of heritage. They thought speed would blunt the edge. They thought that a fast lab result, the right headline, a polished apology, and an access-controlled payment could erase the spectacle. They were wrong about one thing. Paper has ways of betraying hurry. Lena had no lawyer in that gilded room. She had her battered notebook and a small USB drive she had accepted months ago when a woman with a kind, tired face and salt gray hair said she was leaving town and wanted to be sure certain things were kept safe. The woman had been Evelyn Kestrel's old friend, if the stories stitched across Lena's life were true. The bakery woman had laughed softly when Lena asked why she had given the pendant to her. "Because sometimes people need to be found," she said. This piece, belongs to a family with clocks, not coin. It needs someone who keeps time, not someone who spends it." In the side room, Lena opened the notebook once and thumbed to a folded corner. In it were names written in a tidy, looped hand. Evelyn Kestrel, Kestrel Holding AG, a notarized stamp, a courier route, small amounts scribbled in margins as if someone had been afraid of numbers. She thought about what would happen if those names were real, and someone powerful wanted to make them vanish. She did not sign the papers.
"Then you'll be in the papers," Cade said, leaning forward. His voice was not raised. It was an offer and a threat that were the same thing. "We can make this quieter. We can make it less painful. You'll have to disappear from other people's feeds." Lena stood. She held the pendant where Sharon and Cade could see it. "If I disappear," she said, "someone will find these." She tapped the notebook, then the pocket where the USB rested, "and they'll know who I am and who," the word Evelyn felt like a key, "who she was." Cade drew back slightly, as if they had all forgotten that papers can move like small, patient animals out of the cages men build for them. It is possible to doctor a face in a photograph. It is much harder to erase a notarized seal, a dated signature, the stamped ink of a Swiss office, if those things existed. It is possible to hurry a lab into a sympathetic result. It is harder to recreate a courier's log, an email that once left a machine and sits in the quiet record of the internet. Someone in the corner, quiet until that moment, watched Lena with a look that could have been curiosity or calculation. Reed, quiet in the way some people are quiet because they listen, not because they don't want to be heard, had arrived as if he had known something was shifting. He had been at the wedding to support a friend. He had been close enough to see how gestures became statements, but not close enough to be complicit in the script Cade and Sharon had written. Reed crossed the room the way he moved through meetings, silently, with a pack of details collected. He took Lena's elbow and guided her out into cool air. The ballroom's heat electrified against the sudden quiet. The city beyond the hotel windows hummed with not yet formed story. "You don't have to do this alone," Reed said. He slid his phone across. No, not his phone. He tapped a message into it with fingers that had the economy of a man who made decisions on the basis of evidence rather than theatrics. The message was simple. If they push, we push back. Paper first. She read his face. She read his willingness to listen. Reed's life was not in the kind of headlines Michael cultivated. He had been a strategist behind closed doors, the sort of executive who had a collection of legal pads and friends in compliance. He did not promise heroics. He promised competence. They went to the bakery on a late, uneasy night, while news channels still looped the footage. The bakery warm like a confession. The woman, Baker, for want of a better name, she had thick hands and a quiet laugh. Set a mug in front of Lena and did not ask about the wedding. She had given Lena the pendant for reasons she now explained, in a way that made Lena's spine remember the ledger habit even more. It belonged to Evelyn Kestrel, she said, not in the rich people way, in the "this family keeps things that do things" way. Evelyn used to come by with lists of where to place scholarships, where to fund clinics. She had papers in German and in English, and she liked them to be read out loud when she decided things. "So it means Lena began. "Maybe it means you're the right person to hold the key," the baker said. "Maybe it means nothing at all. But the pendant was a marker. You did not bring it for you. You brought it to be found." Lena thought about the notary stamp the bakery woman had imitated with finger ink the week before she pinned the pendant, a private joke about the way small towns kept secrets. She thought of Evelyn Kestrel as a rumor that smelled like lemon oil and old money, as if legacy were a scent more than a ledger. Reed sat across from them and said quietly, "We'll document everything." Thus began the patient work, a series of small gestures that multiplied into a map. Reed called people he knew who worked with audits and with the kind of filing systems that did not allow stories to smooth themselves into absolution. He called a woman who once taught him how to read an invoice for the lies it contained. He texted a friend in a Swiss firm he trusted enough to say, without naming names, "Possible trust? Need eyes." The text read like a breadcrumb. In the world of finance and legacies, crumbs are sometimes the way you find the loaf.
The first move was mundane and familiar to anyone who has watched an intricate plan assembled under fluorescent light. Obtain chain of custody documents, get a copy of the courier manifest, request the lab's time-stamped results. Reed's people liked paper. Paper doesn't lie, one of them said. It just needs careful listening. They began to ask for receipts, for shipping numbers, for the street-level details that no one glamorous ever bothered to preserve. It was Reed who first noticed an odd footnote appended to the lab's preliminary report that had been leaked to the press. A timestamp that arrived before the courier manifest indicated the pendant had left the hotel. The lab's cover note described a rushed request, an expedited chain, a small query about origin. It also included a line about unverifiable sample provenance that had been conveniently omitted in the version distributed to certain reporters. They dug. Lena watched while they dug. For someone used to the brief encounters of city life, drop packages, pick them up, leave, this was different. She had spent her days with other people's lives folded into cardboard. Now her life was unboxed under lights. She took the notebook out and offered it up, page by page. There was a receipt from a courier company she had used often, an inked stamp from a small notary service downtown, a folded letter with Evelyn's small, practiced signature. Reed arranged for a digital copy of the USB to be made and for it to be hashed, recorded in a way that would prove later whether it had been altered. He explained it in the kind of plain language that helps a person feel in the room with processes that are ordinarily invisible.
"We make a fingerprint of this file," he said. "Then, if anyone says it changed, we show the fingerprint and the chain will not line up." A forensic team arrived quietly, not with film crews, but with laptops and boxy drives that hummed like small refrigerators. There were people with headphones who spoke in clipped jargon at first, then translated. Metadata, timestamps, header logs. Lena learned to listen for the cadence of the truth, not as a single moment, but as a pattern. "Look here," one young analyst said, pointing at a screen where emails stacked like a small city. "This server shows a delivery acknowledgement at 1922. The lab report is time-stamped at 1907. Someone had put the conclusion before the arrival. The hairline crack the auditors like to hunt had appeared in the form of a simple mislaid sequence." Reed's team moved outward. Contact the lab for records. Request the manifest copies. Ask the hotel for CCTV footage. They were careful, conservative in language, quick in motion. They filed requests in ways designed to be preserved. They sent preliminary legal letters marked for record. They did not shout into the void. Meanwhile, Michael's camp moved as well, but with different energy. PR teams scripted a narrative of romance and spontaneity. A private investigator contacted influencers with a tidy backstory about Lena, painting her as a woman who liked attention. Small scandals grew like rot in damp wood, rumors that had the shape of malice and the breath of desperation. The scarfed consultant posted laboratory credentials like talismans. He invited certain news desks to exclusive briefings. The story migrated from social media to a nightly cycle. People who had been present at the party were interviewed and said things like, "I thought it was a joke," or "He's always been a romantic." These were the kinds of notes that spin doctors feed to microphones, the sweeter versions of truth. But in a small office, Reed's team collected something else, an invoice trail that did not quite match the story. Payments were routed through a chain of shell vendors with names that read like old poems. Riverline PR, North Compass Consultants. The amounts were small enough to evade rigorous scrutiny at first glance, and large enough, when added together, to make the ledger uncomfortable. They flagged a payment to a private lab the day before the wedding, an expedited service fee. The amount was not large in the scale of corporate spends, but the timing was precise. "Follow the vendors," Reed said. He had learned the old rule: where money moves, someone leaves footprints. Those footsteps led beyond the obvious. They led to a lab that had an office in a nondescript building and a voicemail greeting that emphasized quick, accurate results. The lab's managing director answered the phone as if in rehearsed surprise when asked about the wedding sample. He mentioned confidentiality, then fumbled for a paper not because he was incompetent, but because competence sometimes requires a story. He asked for proof of authorization. They sent the proof. It arrived in formats that later felt sticky and hurried. The Scarfed Consultants Network moved faster, and initially it seemed the world would accept the hurried conclusion. A low-resolution lab report hit a partner outlet within hours. Analysis suggested the pendant's composition was inconsistent with materials typically associated with the kestrel heirlooms. The headline was exacting: expert, pendant not kestrel. Michael's camp used it as a broom to sweep scandal into an acceptable corner. But speed made mistakes. Reed's people found a lab technician's shift log that had not matched the published timestamps. A courier signature, the one that would show who had transported the sample, was missing. An email header carried a note about a rush-to-clear narrative, language that could be read many ways, but that, once read, did not feel accidental. Lena remembered the bakery woman's words and felt, at the same time, a memory of Evelyn Kestrel's handwriting, an almost forgotten script that had the stubbornness of a signature left to age. She began to understand the leverage of being small and meticulous in a room where everyone else assumed that spectacle outranked ledger. Reed called a meeting in a small conference room that smelled faintly of coffee in the city. They gathered a forensic accountant, a digital forensics lead, and a Swiss counsel Reed had roused with a single line about a possible trust instrument. Names were said aloud that felt like instruments themselves: Kestrel Holding AG, an estate plan notarized 3 years prior, a charitable trust with discretionary funds earmarked for community clinics. The Swiss counsel, polite, precise, emphasized that the question was tenure of documents and whether a claimant could show a chain of intent and custody sufficient to convince the authorities to act. "We are not promising outcomes," she said carefully, "but we can present a prima facie case that demands preservation. Temporary measures are available in certain jurisdictions. A court can be asked to prevent dissipation if there is reasonable ground to believe interference is imminent." They began to build a strategy in patient, short sentences: secure physical evidence, document digital traces, preserve chain of custody, and file for preservation orders where appropriate. Reed spoke rarely, but when he did, his words landed like coins in a jar. He emphasized a principle people in his world repeated as if it were a prayer: the law favors paper. Piece by piece they assembled it, photographed the pendant, logged its serial number, filled out a chain of custody form with an independent third party watching. They made copies of the notebook and recorded a checksum for the USB. Reed sent a restrained letter to Michael's counsel requesting voluntary preservation of relevant documents and making clear that outside counsel had been engaged in the event cooperation was not received. Meanwhile, the public appetite for the story grew. Late-night shows riffed on the image of a CEO stepping away from a fortune-style life for a courier. The bride hired a crisis manager whose tweets read like polished grief. The papers that had been fed the faster lab result now had to reckon with a different set of facts trickling into their inboxes. Invoices that did not match deposit dates, a courier app history that logged a pickup earlier than the time the pendant supposedly left the hotel, and a fragment of CCTV from a hotel back corridor that raised more questions than it answered. Reed's digital forensics lead, a woman named Amaya who liked to speak in small clarities, spent a late night with Lena going through messages. "We'll make sure these get anchored," she told Lena, which was her way of saying the team would stop anyone from later falsifying the trail. She explained what the hashing did in a way that was patient and human. "It's like a digital thumbprint.
If anyone tries to change the file, the print won't match. Lena watched as her life, previously arranged in simple tasks, became knotted with legalese and timestamps. It frightened her and steadied her both. There were threats, too, subtle ones dressed as counsel. A corporate attorney sent a note reminding her of defamatory potential and offering a settlement that would ensure her silence and protect the groom's privacy. The offer came by email and was polite enough to be dangerous. Cade's fixers were adept at making contracts look like comforts and silences look like mercy. Lena's bank account, modest, messy, remained untouched. Her apartment keys were still on the same ring. She slept during odd hours and woke with the exhaustion of someone who had stepped under a floodlight. The bakery woman visited with a package of almond twists and a tiny envelope. Inside the envelope was a photocopy of a notarized letter from a small Swiss office, the kind of document that could be a keystone or nothing, depending on whether the original could be found and authenticated. Reed set up a small war room of sticky notes and scanned files. He organized people into teams. The auditors would follow the money. The digital team would trace metadata, the counsel would seek preservation orders, a PR advisor, quiet and pragmatic, would shape a defensive public posture. No melodrama, no temptation to trade truth for quiet. Lena was asked to give a recorded statement to a lawyer, short, factual, habitually honest. She was coached not to speculate and to stick to what she knew: dates, times, names, and the chain of events. The scarfed consultant kept pushing for headlines and quick exonerations. He offered to have a friendly lab rep speak to the press.
Cade's people sent out feelers to the bride's inner circle, trying to create tiny fissures of doubt about what had happened in the weeks before the wedding. Lena had been seen around, an anonymous note suggested to an influencer. Is it possible this was orchestrated? The line smacked of a script meant to inoculate reputations. But the ledger had a life of its own. An auditor noticed a vendor listed as Nexus Logistics with an account number that, when traced, routed through 2 more shell companies, each with their own invoices and invoices to reconcile. The payments were styled as consulting or expedited services. They were not overtly illegal, perhaps, only items arranged in ways that suggested intent to obscure. The auditors added another sticky note to the war room wall: document every step, no matter how trivial. A first draft of a legal filing, rudimentary and deliberately restrained, was prepared to request a temporary preservation order. It did not promise a final outcome. It requested that relevant parties be prevented from disposing of documents that might bear on the question of whether the pendant connected to any claim upon Kestrel resources. The counsel used phrases like prima facie showing and risk of dissipation. Reed watched the room as if listening to the walls. He knew the order might be denied. He also knew the alternative, leaving everything to the speed of PR, would be a loss. The first small victory arrived not as a headline, but as a grainy CCTV file pulled from a corridor camera. It showed a courier van pulling up at the hotel hours before the wedding. A driver with a clipped step carrying a small package in. The timestamp on the CCTV matched the courier manifest, not the lab note that had gone to friendly press. The pendulum of order swung in a way that felt chemical, not dramatic, not definitive, but meaningful. It meant someone could, with patience, begin to question the expedited narrative. At dawn, while the city was still collecting its breath after the night's media storms, Reed's counsel submitted the preservation letter to Michael's legal team and to the lab. Preserve all samples, preserve all notes, preserve video. The request was a small legal shackle, intended to keep things where they could be seen. That evening, in a hotel room with the shades half drawn, Lena sat with the pendant cupped in her palm. The chain felt fragile between her fingers. Outside, a late-night news host speculated about the spectacle. Romance or PR, they asked, as if those were mutually exclusive rather than often both. Lena felt the tiredness of a woman who had been thrust into the bright, uncomfortable intersection of rumor and record.
She remembered the bakery woman's laugh and the way she had said, "Some things find the right person at odd times." Reed sat beside her, a cup of coffee gone tepid in his hand. "We start with preservation," he said softly. "We don't have to be loud. Paper will do the yelling if it needs to." "But what if they scrub?" Lena asked. "That's why we document. That's why we hash the files. That's why you didn't sign the NDA," Reed replied. He did not need to say that she had made a brave choice. The ledger of small, determined acts did that for her. The next days unfolded into two different tempos. The public tempo, loud, immediate, shaped by PR cycles, and the procedural tempo, slow, relentless, arithmetic. The city watched the theater. A quieter group watched the archives. Late on a Tuesday, a junior analyst called Reed with a voice that had the thin thrill of discovery. "We found a payment trail into Riverline PR," she said, "from a shell called Eastgate Services. Eastgate received a wire the afternoon before the lab report. The bank memo reads, 'Expedite clarity.'" The words were almost comical in their frankness. They read like the kind of note a nervous clerk would leave to justify a transfer. Reed told her to get the SWIFT copies, the originator reference numbers, and any corresponding invoices. Each tiny confirmation was a bead on a wire. Collect enough beads and you could reconstruct a necklace. The scarfed consultant retaliated in the media. A statement that the pendant's composition suggested it came from a modern alloy, not a family heirloom. A trending opinion piece suggested that Lena's acceptance of the pendant displayed poor judgment. Coverage leaned into narrative. The man who loved a courier, the woman whose life was now a headline. The bride, defended by courteous publicists, gave a short statement expressing shock and sorrow and requested privacy. She did not, publicly, dramatize her pain. Those closest to her whispered different truths at quieter tables. In the war room, Reed circled dates. The auditors traced invoices, the forensic team matched server headers, and the Swiss counsel sent a careful note outlining how a notarized letter, if genuine, could create sufficient cause for a preservation order in Switzerland and related jurisdictions. "Temporary measures," she wrote, "can prevent the dissipation of assets while ownership claims are considered." The language was careful because law must be patient where headlines are impulsive. Late into the week, they compelled the first real concession. The lab agreed to provide unredacted lab logs and the list of technicians on duty. It was not an admission of wrongdoing. It was the opening of a door. When the lab's logs arrived, inconsistencies poked out like small bones. A technician had recorded a sample number that did not correspond with the pendant tag on the chain of custody form included in the reactive press packet. A second record showed that a supervisor had authorized an expedited notation in an email chain that included the words, "protect narrative," a phrase that landed like a bruise when read aloud in Reed's office. "These are headline phrases," one of the auditors said. "They show intent."
Reed's team redoubled their efforts. They served formal preservation notices to Riverline PR and to North Compass Consultants. They requested CCTV retention orders from the hotel and copies of internal emails sent to the bridesmaids who had been present. The legal filings were intentionally lean. They did not assert guilt. They asserted risk and requested protection. Meanwhile, Lena's life elongated into small human vignettes that reminded Reed and the team why any of them had gotten involved. On a Sunday morning, Lena visited a community clinic where a poster read in neat type, "Evelyn Kestrel Community Health Initiative," and a picture of a woman in a hat smiling like a promise. Lena learned that a check for a small grant had once been issued in the late hours of a quiet year. The clinic director spoke in lines that made Lena's heart tighten. The funds had been irregular, but when they arrived, they paid for vaccinations and for a worker who went door to door. Lena thought about what it would mean if that work stopped because of rumor. They found more pieces. A notarized letter in a P.O. box that had her name on it.
An old trust document with names that matched the handwriting in her notebook. Reed knew they were not yet ready to stand in courtrooms and announce facts. They had to present an argument that would persuade a judge to act conservatively and preserve resources. He preferred the slow accumulation of a case to a loud theatrical claim that might crumble upon inspection. The public, never patient for slow things, cratered into speculation. Opinion columns divided. Some argued Michael's confusion with the truest kind of romantic epiphany. Others called it bravado. Lena received hate and sympathy in similar measures. She read both, then looked away and went back to the ledger. The life of someone who once moved packages from point to point is not glamorous. It is practical. She anchored herself in the details. The time a courier logged a pickup, the stamp on a notary's paper, a signature pressed into an envelope like a small, stubborn truth. Then, one afternoon, an email appeared in Reed's inbox that read like a small thunderclap. It came from a forensic technician who had been asked to look not at medals and not at headlines, but at the chain of custody documents themselves. "We can't account for sample number 3 between 1850 and 1915, the technician wrote. Documented transfer is missing. There's an annotation in a private channel indicating an expedited insertion. We can pull the internal audit log, but the concern is someone could have introduced a sample." Reed read the line twice. In the room, the hum of the server felt suddenly loud. The implication was not yet an allegation, it was a question. Documents that had been thought simple were not. The lab's quick answer to a PR problem might have created a paper trail that, when watched closely, suggested a different story. They had not proved tampering. They had, however, found room enough to insist on watching closely. A preservation order they drafted would ask the court to prevent any disposal or tampering during the pendency of their inquiry. It would not convict. It would freeze time long enough to preserve whether any wrongdoing had occurred. Reed's counsel revised the language until it was a measured plea. The motion would ask for interim relief on the basis of reasonable likelihood that records were being altered, and that dissipation of assets was a plausible risk. They did not use poetic phrasing. They used paragraphs that would sit well in a judge's hands. Reed submitted the motion to a clerk, and the clerk stamped the page with an unremarkable ink that felt in that moment like a small shield. After the filing, the PR machinery accelerated its counterpush. A press release landed in the inboxes of every major outlet saying that the groom had been misrepresented and that a rumor had been weaponized against a man who had celebrated love. The headline writers, always hungry for symmetry, balanced the story into neat halves. The narrative wanted 2 equal parts, romance and scandal. But Reed and his circle preferred graph lines and timestamps. At the end of a week that had begun with a glittering wedding and a pendant catching the light, the team had managed to force a pause. The court clerk had scheduled a preliminary hearing to consider preservation. The lab had been requested to produce unredacted logs. The hotel had preserved CCTV. Riverline PR had acknowledged receipt of the preservation letter and agreed to retain servers. These were hardly dramatic victories, but they were the kind the law respects. Small controls placed where the air smelled of scent and image. Lena stood in the bakery late that night, watching the bakery woman knead dough as if rhythm could be testimony. The pendant lay in a small box on the counter, quiet and circled with crumbs of sugar. Lena felt the world tilt, not because she had earned a spectacle, but because someone had decided she was worth one. She did not crave spectacle. She craved that the people Evelyn had intended to help continue to exist. "I don't want them to burn it all down," she said, voice low. "You don't have to," the baker replied. "Paper is stubborn. It remembers." The phone chimed with a new message. It was from Reed.
We have a preservation date. We're getting the lab logs. Don't change anything. Be in the room Friday." Lena tucked the pendant back into the small box as if tucking a child into bed. Outside, the city breathed the long exhale of a story that had not yet finally found its shape. Inside, Reed's team prepared the kinds of documents that will ask a court to keep things intact long enough for truth to be traced. They were not yet at a high point. They had not yet made an unassailable case. They had, however, made a choice to let paper and process find what spectacle had tried to obscure. They would have to be patient. The law moves by inches. The press moves by clicks. The difference between them would be where justice, however slow and bureaucratic, could outlast a single performance. On Friday morning, Reed arrived at his office with a small envelope. Inside, a photocopy of a letter with a Swiss notary stamp. It was not the original, only a scanned image, and it required verification. The photocopy was a start. Reed looked at Lena across the table as if gauging how much any of this had cost her. The pendant sat between them like a small island, and on the island were the outlines of a life that could be reshaped. "We are going to ask for a temporary freeze," Reed said. "If we can show that these documents plausibly indicate an interest enough to require preservation, then a court can take steps to stop transfers. It won't be permanent, it won't be conclusive, but it buys time." Lena thought of the clinic staff, the kids who had been vaccinated from a check that once arrived late in a year, the bakery woman's hands. She thought of what it would mean to let money once earmarked for community go where men like Michael thought it should. She imagined what Evelyn would have wanted. She did not crave to be the villain or the heroine. She desired, in the small human way she had always lived, to make sure the work of small people continued. "Do it," she said. They filed for the preservation order the same week. The motion was not dramatic. It asked the court to take a provisional step. It relied on documents that were incomplete but plausible. A notarized letter with a faint Swiss stamp, and a line in a practiced hand that read, in translation, "For disposition upon demonstrable claim." It was small, bureaucratic, and heavy like a hinge. The filing clerk had accepted their request to place the matter on an expedited administrative calendar. Preservation first, fact-finding next. Reed had learned that the law liked to be given reasons in neat stacks. He had given one. Stay to see how a trinket rewrites a fortune. The preliminary hearing moved more slowly than cable news. In the courtroom's cool light, a judge with indifferent shoes listened while lawyers read summaries of timestamps and manifest entries. Reed's counsel paced through the argument, as if laying tiles. The notarized letter suggested an interest. The lab logs contained gaps. Vendor payments indicated an effort to accelerate a narrative. They asked only for preservation and for a temporary hold on transactions that might move funds tied to the Kestrel instruments while they investigated. Michael's counsel responded with practiced calm. He couched the counterargument in image-friendly phrases, preserving privacy, avoiding spectacle, and, on the record, requested that any restraint be narrowly tailored. He emphasized Michael's presumption of innocence and the importance of not using judicial power to amplify rumor. The judge nodded, not yet a man of thunder. After a measured consideration, he granted a limited preservation order. Retain samples, preserve logs, and institute a temporary freeze on discretionary transfers linked to the trust instruments potentially implicated. It was not a judgment of ownership. It was a judicial pause. For Reed and Lena, it was a hard-won breathing space. The order made the story legible to institutions that cared for cash and continuity. The notary office in Zurich, when contacted by Swiss counsel, acknowledged receipt of an inquiry about a trust instrument associated with Evelyn Kestrel, and confirmed that a scanned registry entry existed and matched the handwriting in Lena's notebook. The Swiss response was careful. Preliminary confirmation of registry entry.
Authenticating original will require production of sealed file. Yet the mere confirmation that a registry item matched was enough to shift the posture of custodians. Banks who move only to tidy saw reason to be conservative. Every legal pause invited a new round of public commentary. Opinion pieces argued about spontaneous romance and the cruelty of spectacle. Late-night hosts made barbs out of heartbreak. Yet under headlines, Reed's team worked in an increasingly clinical rhythm. Chain of custody reconstruction, subpoena service, deposition scheduled. They prepared for the ritual every litigator knows well. Testimony under oath, words that cannot be unspoken once a court reporter has finger-punched the keystrokes. Depositions began with the lab. The scarfed consultant appeared on a video link. The scarf a deliberate eccentricity that rode the frame like a banner of credibility. His voice was thin at first. He delivered lines shaped for cameras but subject to a more relentless medium. Under oath, his confident certainties thinned. When asked to produce authorizations and timestamps, he supplied a binder of documents with corners too conveniently straight. When questioned about communications that used the phrase "expedite the narrative," he smiled and said it had been colloquial, a shorthand, nothing more. But his emails, archived by the forensic team and printed in black on white, existed regardless of his intent. They showed requests to move quickly and invoices routed through vendors whose purpose appeared to be speed and opacity. Lawyers do not have to innuendo. They can let an email do the heavy lifting. A lab technician, young, competent, and plainly uncomfortable, testified that standard operating procedure required a continuous log, and that samples should remain in strict custody while being prepared for analysis. Her voice bore the cadence of someone who had once loved a job for its order. She admitted there were gaps in the recorded movements of one sample, time entries that did not reconcile with the published report. Under questioning, the technician described an off-book handoff she had later reported internally, anomalies that her supervisor had annotated as administrative oversight. The supervisor's notes, Deloitte style in their blandness, were later revealed in deposition as having been added after a rush of external inquiries. On another day, the scarf consultant's associate, a man who handled vendor relations, sat before a table of counsel and spoke in confined terms. He could or would not explain why certain vendor invoices had routing codes that suggested layered payments. He would admit to authorizing a series of expedite charges, but claimed they were standard PR fees to ensure timely communications. The words standard and timely slid through the hearing room like sluiced water, both necessary and insufficient explanations for money that, when peer-reviewed by Reed's auditors, bent toward pattern. Pattern, not single X, make a case persuasive. The deposition transcripts took on a texture like old ledgers. Numbers in the margins, phrases in the body, a series of admissions that, when stitched together, suggested more than any single witness would speak. A project manager from Riverline PR testified that she had been instructed to soft launch a lab's preliminary results to favorite outlets. Her testimony was precise and quiet. She handed over a string of messages between Riverline and the scarf consultant that read, in blunt phrases, like instructions. Get sample out, land story, protect Grome. Words that, in their plainness, smelled of coordination rather than chance. The auditors followed the money like hounds. They requested swift copies and bank memos. They asked for invoice chains from Eastgate and North Compass. The transfers were legal in form. A payment could be described as consulting or technical services. Yet the flow of funds, small sums, too deliberate in timing, began to read as a pulley system pulled tight in the night. Each memo that contained the phrase expedite clarity or protect narrative rang a small, warnable bell in Reed's mind. Legal teams do not have to find fraud to show that actions were orchestrated to shape a public record, and shaping a record can carry civil consequences for those who implement it. Meanwhile, Michael's boardroom crumbled in stages that mirrored the press cycle. Institutional investors, who seldom meddled in the romantic misadventures of executives, cared deeply about governance. They cared about disclosure, about contingency, about reputational risk that led to operational disruption. Reed's counsel forwarded a carefully annotated packet to several major shareholders. Documents that summarized the preserved logs, the vendor payment chains, the Swiss notary acknowledgement, and the court's preservation order. The packet was factual, lean, and devastating in its accumulation. A special committee convened. Boardroom meetings, filmed in shorthand minutes and careful memos, debated a simple calculus. Can a single executive's exposure compromise governance? The committee asked for an independent investigation and voted to suspend Michael from day-to-day authority while it reviewed the findings. They did not declare him guilty. They invoked neutral, conventional reasons: operational continuity, investor confidence, fiduciary prudence, and in doing so, they stripped him of the performance of power he had practiced in the limelight. Michael, who had been a man of gestures, now found that procedure had its own gestures. Suspension, governed by bylaws and minutes, is a quieter, more permanent kind of disempowerment than any viral gif. The removal of Michael's operational authority did not happen in a vacuum. Cade Marrow's communications team attempted to spin the suspension as a precautionary step and not a punishment. They painted Michael as a victim of a politicized press that equated headlines with guilt. But the board's motion was procedural and final enough to spook markets and to loosen the grip of powerful allies who valued predictability. In private, some allies signaled that they would step away until matters were cleared. The machinery that had once amplified Michael's decisions found itself, for the first time, subject to minutes and votes. Back on Lena's side, the Swiss notary's office agreed to a preliminary authentication. The signature line on the scanned document corresponded to the office's registry code and matched an earlier sample kept in vault records. The verification was not the opening of a vault. It was a thread a counsel could pull to ask for more. With verification in hand, Reed's counsel sought a temporary restraining order that would prevent discretionary transfers from the trust while the claim of beneficiary interest was adjudicated. The legal move was narrow, intended to prevent the erosion of assets while the question of rightful stewardship was considered. The banking institutions that managed assets linked to Kestrel instruments received the court's hold and, with careful conservatism, placed temporary restrictions on certain outgoing transactions pending adjudication. The language in their notices was neutral: temporary hold pending verification, but the practical effect was immediate. Discretionary allocations were paused, scheduled transfers suspended. Men who were used to signing checks and calling vendors to implement transfers found that a judge's stamp and a counsel's request had stopped the machine. Michael's immediate reaction was theatrical rather than procedural. He gave 2 televised interviews in which he described the episode at the altar as a moment of truth. He called Lena's public presence a personal choice and framed the entire spectacle as private life spilled into public view. But the camera's glow was dimmer now that institutional actors had stepped in.
Shareholders asked questions at board meetings. Auditors read with their pens poised. Regulators, who prefer not to be surprised, sat forward with interest. PR could not undo a clerk's stamp or a notary's registry note. Under the preservation order, the forensic team gained access to internal emails that had previously circulated in ad hoc channels. One message thread, when printed and placed under a lamp, looked like a small conspiracy of language. Instructions to accelerate the narrative. Notes about selective releases. A line about making it ours. Those words mattered less as theater than as evidence of intent to create an alternate public record. A forensic accountant testified that while no single payment created a crime on its own, the pattern suggested a deliberate effort to create misleading impressions, an important distinction that can influence corporate governance decisions and civil liability. Deposition after deposition added nuance. A hotel manager testified that the hotel's security logs had been preserved. and that the timing on certain back corridor footage corroborated the courier manifest rather than the lab's preliminary timestamp. A courier driver's sworn statement confirmed pickup and drop at times that did not align with the scarfed consultant's initial press release. The cumulative effect of these testimonies was not a single flash verdict, but a collage of discordant claims that, when layered, suggested orchestration. As the procedural narrative thickened, journalists began to ask different questions. Headlines that had once favored romance shifted to governance and process. The tale of a groom abandoning vows for a courier became a case study in how power uses speed to shape stories, and how patience, paperwork, and the small persistence of records can blunt that power. Public sympathy, too, began to parse into more complex shapes. The bride's name, once a whispered tragedy, now became a character in a larger story about institutions and legacies. Amid the legal turmoil, Lena's life tilted toward responsibility. The possibility that the trust she was now linked to might fund community clinics and scholarships reframed her choices. She could have been tempted, as the press insinuated, to use the moment for spectacle, an HBO-style revenge. But her ledger habit and the bakery woman's quiet counsel anchored her. Reed offered structures, interim stewardship, transparent oversight, independent directors to govern allocations. He proposed a fiduciary plan that would honor Evelyn Kestrel's documented charitable intent while insulating the trust from theatrical appropriation. A preliminary court hearing resulted in a narrowly tailored ruling. The judge granted a temporary freeze on discretionary transfers pending evidentiary hearings and recognized Lena as an interested claimant for the purposes of discovery. The ruling stopped the moving parts that could have bled funds into untraceable accounts.
It also, importantly, recognized the need for an independent interim steward capable of preserving the trust's charitable objectives. The judge did not declare ownership, she preserved the estate's continuity against dissipation. With the legal scaffolding in place, a small, careful board of trustees was assembled to hold the trust's position until a definitive determination could be made. Reed proposed a slate: a retired judge, a director who ran community clinics, a compliance officer from a neutral institution, and Lena. The proposal received pushback. Adversaries called it performative, but it also received quiet nods from the clinic directors who saw the possibility of continuity for programs that had helped dozens. They were particularly interested in ensuring that funds earmarked for vaccination drives and school scholarships did not evaporate in a PR war. Lena accepted a role of interim stewardship with measured terms. She would have a voice, not unilateral authority. She would sign off on grants proposed by the committee and insist on transparent audits. She refused to let passion dictate allocations. "We are not here to enact revenge," she told the committee in their first meeting. "We are here to make sure what was intended for people keeps getting to people." Her voice was plain. It carried the steady quality of someone used to delivering things on time. The trustees instituted immediate pragmatic steps. They audited current commitments, prioritized active programs, and established a small emergency fund to keep clinics and scholarships operating. They commissioned an independent audit to inventory the trust's holdings, cash flows, and obligations. They drafted bylaws that required committee approval for all large discretionary transfers and put in place an external auditor with the power to sign off on allocations. Lena insisted that beneficiaries have a line of contact and that decisions be documented in minutes made public on a simple website. No opulence, only transparency. Those minutes mattered. Transparency, Reed explained, is a force multiplier. If a rumor can be amplified by obscurity, then the opposite is also true. Clarity dismantles rumor. The trust's new posture, open minutes, independent oversight, public audited statements, disarmed many of the spin tactics that had worked when everything had been moving in private. Michael's position, once predicated on cultivated charisma, declined along a different axis. His control over discretionary arguments frayed as the board moved to implement independent checks. A few long-term allies whispered that his style of governance, flashy deals, theatrical gestures, had long been contingent on the goodwill of institutions that preferred continuity. With those institutions leaning toward conservatism, Michael had less room to operate. He found himself, for the first time, subject to motions and votes rather than applause.
The legal process continued. Depositions accumulated. A judge scheduled evidentiary hearings. Reed's team prepared a dossier that included hashed copies of Lena's USB files, notarized originals, swift trace summaries, and sworn depositions. The dossier did not thunder, it layered. Judges prefer layered arguments because they are harder to unweave. The case became a demonstration of the institutional power of paperwork. While courts adjudicated, the trustees moved to prevent harm to the community. They drew up an emergency grant to maintain clinic operations in neighborhoods where Evelyn's support had been most consequential. They revived a scholarship program that had lapsed and funded a mobile health unit to visit outlying neighborhoods. Lena insisted on a public sign-off for each grant and on small, direct stories to prove impact. The child who could afford school books, the nurse whose salary kept the clinic open, the doors opened by a community fund. Reed watched her insistence with a kind of quiet admiration. Where spectacle had sought to consume, stewardship sought to restore. The public began to see the consequences in human terms. A short profile appeared in a local paper focusing on a neighborhood clinic. It described a nurse keeping late hours and a refrigerator full of vaccines paid for by a delayed check that had, for months, been the difference between immunizations and shortages. The article mentioned Lena only briefly, but it tied the human effect of funds to the question the lawsuit was trying to answer: who gets to decide how a legacy is spent? The narrative shifted subtly from scandal to stewardship. Michael, now stripped of some authority, attempted a countermove. He filed a petition contesting the preservation measures and seeking to redefine the scope of the trust's discretionary powers. His legal team argued that the measures were overbroad, that a court should be cautious about freezing the movement of funds, and that a man's private decisions were now being judged by a very public committee. Reed countered with a calm, circumspect approach. The preservation sought to protect intent until evidence clarified who held rightful stewardship. The court, wary of both overreach and dilution of trust assets, continued its deliberation. In depositions, Michael's defense appeared less confident. Witnesses described internal memos that had the tone of defensive posture rather than conspiracy. Emails that had once been sent in the soft glow of a PR emergency now read as attempts to manage a narrative. Reed's counsel in cross-examination did not rely on drama. She relied on sequence, payment memos, timestamp inconsistencies, chain of custody gaps. The more she pressed, the more the public record accumulated. At a hearing that would later be described in media breathlessly with the wrong adjective, the court issued a preliminary ruling that required the trustees to maintain the hold and directed expedited discovery. In depositions, Michael's defense appeared less confident. Witnesses described internal memos that had the tone of defensive posture rather than conspiracy. Emails that had once been sent in the soft glow of a PR emergency now read as attempts to manage a narrative. Reed's counsel in cross-examination did not rely on drama. She relied on sequence, payment memos, timestamp inconsistencies, chain of custody gaps. The more she pressed, the more the public record accumulated. At a hearing that would later be described in media breathless with the wrong adjective, the court issued a preliminary ruling that required the trustees to maintain the hold and directed expedited discovery. The ruling was careful in tone. It did not determine final ownership. It did not declare guilt. It recognized that a plausible claim existed and that immediate steps were necessary to prevent irreversible transfers. For Lena, the ruling was a legal milestone. For Michael, it was a loss of narrative power. The freezing of discretionary transfers meant that the things he had hoped to do, reward allies, reshape funds according to his instincts, would require more oversight and time than he had expected. In private, Michael's legal counsel advised him to avoid public combat. Procedure will be kinder to you than spectacle, they said. He listened, but narrative habits are not undone overnight. The man who had loved a stage found it harder to endure the quiet work of documents. Weeks became months. The hearing schedule stretched as complex discovery unearthed new artifacts, internal memos, a courier's handwritten route slips, a registrar's log, and a sealed vault that contained a ledger with Evelyn Kestrel's signature and instructions that favored community allocations. Each new artifact required authentication. Each authentication required process. The law is not swift in the way a scandal can be, but it is patient in a way that matters. Throughout, Lena refused offers meant to buy silence or to turn her into a spectacle. One meeting, arranged in a design meant to flatter with luxury and promise, offered her a comfortable settlement contingent on non-disclosure. Reed had been in the room. He had watched how the offer's warmth was a method of evaporation. Lena's answer was simple and exacting. I'll sign nothing that stops the clinics or the scholarships. That resolve shifted the calculations of more than one interlocutor. Some of Michael's allies, pragmatic rather than doctrinal, began to counsel a negotiated path. Peace in exchange for governance reforms that would protect both legacy and reputation. The trustees, led by Lena's insistence on transparency, drafted a set of governance reforms that included public reporting, independent auditors, and community advisory seats. They offered to preserve Evelyn's philanthropic intent and to leave final adjudication of ownership to courts while ensuring that programs would not be starved. Negotiation, not vengeance, became the instrument of practical justice. The board accepted reforms. The trustees used existing residual powers to recommit funds to active programs and to fund emergency needs. The decision was small in headline, but vast in effect. Clinics remained open, a mobile unit remained on the road, scholarships were issued on time. Michael's fall from unchallenged authority had consequences beyond the trust. A corporate governance review found that his leadership style had left risk mitigations weak. Investors demanded a reconstitution of the executive team. He found himself releasing staff and answering to a new board. His charisma sustained fewer votes than it had once bought. The forensic narrative's final scenes were not courtroom fireworks, but quiet audits and signed minutes. The independent auditor's report, when it arrived, was careful. It found irregular vendor routing and recommended further civil action, but declined to state criminal allegations without referral. The report was a blueprint for governance reform more than a last act. It recommended that companies tighten vendor onboarding and that boards institute stricter oversight of communications firms during sensitive moments. The report's language was prosecutorial only in the sense that it demanded accountability. At a trustees' meeting to decide the allocation of a modest portion of discretionary funds, Lena proposed a set of concrete steps: re-establish Evelyn's Community Health Fund, seed an endowment for scholarships in neighborhoods Evelyn had supported, and create a small restitution line for contractors affected by the initial spin, people who had been harmed by the rush to narrative. The trustees approved, with minutes that read like contracts between the past and the future. The community felt the changes long before the press did. At a clinic 2 blocks from a bakery that had first passed a pendant into Lena's hands, a nurse signed a grant letter and wept with relief. "We almost lost our afternoon vaccine sessions," she said. A scholarship recipient wrote a letter thanking the trustees for a program that would fund her nursing training. Reed read the letter aloud in the trustees' room and, for once, allowed himself a small private smile. The machine of procedure had delivered oil to a squeaky wheel.
As for Michael, the legal fight continued. He contested aspects of the trust, filed pleadings, and negotiated. He did not regain the same capacity for unilateral movement. The city's columns analyzed the damage and, in a way, normalized it. The fallibility of someone who had relied on spectacle rather than structural resilience. He remained a figure in the press, but the edge of invulnerability had been blunted by documents and votes. Lena's return to the bakery was a slow, ceremonial thing. She placed the pendant in a small velvet box and handed it to the baker, who took it like a relic and tucked it into a drawer. "Keep it until it's needed," the baker said, and her fingers were steady with the power of someone who knows the right time to hold things. Lena refused offers to wear it as a symbol. She understood that tokens meant little compared to systems that ensured people's medicine and schooling. On a gray morning, Lena convened a small public meeting at the clinic. She spoke not in the magniloquent grammar of scandal, but in plain sentences. "This was never about me," she said. "Someone thought I could be bought, or silenced, or made into a story. I am a person who keeps records. I will help keep records of how these funds are spent." She announced a modest transparency portal and invited community members to join a review board.
The applause was small and earnest. From the edges of the legal theater came a final set of procedural moves. Attorneys negotiated a settlement that allocated certain responsibilities for restoring any reputational harm caused by fast PR and agreed to fund a compliance initiative aimed at preventing similar harm in the future. The settlement included no admission of crime, a point both parties insisted upon, but it required the development of vendor transparency protocols and training for corporate communications teams. These were not dramatic concessions, they were practical changes with the potential for lasting effect. Michael personally issued a short statement expressing regret for the spectacle and acknowledging the need for better governance. The statement was tempered and very public, an attempt to close the chapter. It did not erase the past, but it signaled a recalibration. Institutions had reasserted themselves. Time, which had been an object of Reed's early aphorisms, did the rest. Reports were filed, audits finalized, and the preservation order was gradually relaxed as courts received authenticated originals and as trustees demonstrated their stewardship. Lena's claim moved through the phased processes of civil litigation and settlement. The trust's operational architecture was reformed to include independent oversight. The freeze remained only as long as necessary to ensure the reforms and to preserve the instrument's intended use. When the legal calendar permitted, Lena oversaw the first round of grants under the new governance. A mobile health van visited neighborhoods and set up in school parking lots. Children who had missed vaccines for lack of funds received them free. A small scholarship opened the possibility of nursing education for a young woman who had once staffed a checkout counter. The fruits of paperwork were tangible. Small lives improved in visible ways. Months after the altar, a quiet trustee meeting signed minutes that included a line Lena had asked for. All discretionary funds to be administered with public reporting and annual independent audit. Beneficiaries shall have avenues for appeal. The language was bureaucratic and deliberate. It read like an instrument designed to endure boredom and therefore to outlast scandal. In the evenings, Lena returned to her apartment with stacks of minutes and a thermos of tea. She kept the battered notebook on a shelf and, sometimes, took it down and read Evelyn's looping name as if learning a new language. Her life had changed. She had not sought money or power. She had sought the truth of documents and the continuity of clinics and scholarships. Power, she had learned, was not always who shone the brightest on camera. It was often who ensured that the lights on a clinic stayed on. The bakery remained a touchstone.
Once, when a young woman stopped in to ask about scholarship procedures, Lena sat with her and walked her through the application.
The bakery woman watched from behind the counter, flower on her sleeves, a small smile of approval like a stamp. The pendant lay in the drawer, unloved by spectacle and cherished as a ledger, a marker of intent rather than a talisman of triumph. Michael's fortune, its performance, its capacity to fund discretionary projects, had been curbed long enough for institutions to reassert oversight. He had been clever at narrative. He had not expected that the quiet persistence of paper and procedure could strip him of the immediate freedom to move money at will. In that sense, he had not known the real capacity the woman he had publicly embraced possessed. Not charm or spectacle, but acclaim rooted in documents and the patient tenders of law. The denouement was not cinematic in the way many expected. There was no dramatic scene in which Lena ascended a marble staircase to crow over Michael. Instead, there were minutes, signed and indexed, a mobile health van on a rainy morning, a group of students receiving letters of acceptance attached to small scholarships, a bakery muffin shared in a quiet room. The city continued its noisy life around these modest victories. Newspapers archived the scandal under new tags: governance, legacy, reform. One evening, Lena met Reed at the clinic's back door. They watched a nurse wheel a cart down a corridor. Reed handed her a small packet, a copy of the trustee minutes, the audit summary, and a note from a nurse who had been able to hire staff because funds had been preserved. "You didn't end his fortune," Reed said softly. "You preserved what was meant to be shared." Lena thought of the pendant in its drawer, the bakery woman's hands, and the battered notebook's pages. She thought of the night she declined the folder in the hotel side room, and of the many small acts that led here. A notarized letter, a preserved log, a chain of custody form filled and witnessed, a judge who took a clerk's stamp seriously. The story that had begun at an altar, in the glare of cameras and the roaring oxygen of social media, had ended not at a punchline, but at a ledger. That ledger mattered. In a short public statement, Lena did something the press did not expect. She spoke of duty rather than drama. She thanked the trustees, urged continued transparency, and invited those who cared about Evelyn Kestrel's work to participate in oversight committees. She declined to allow the pendant to become a prop. She kept it tucked away and asked that a small museum, an accessible local archive, be given custody of artifacts related to Evelyn's life, not as trophies, but as records. As seasons changed, the initial shock of a wedding that became a headline became for many a cautionary tale about speed and optics. For the people on the receiving end of restored funds, it was an immediate life-changing correction. Lena did not become a celebrity. She became a steward, a role quiet and unglamorous, governed by minutes, audits, and the steady drip of small grants. Michael reconciled himself to an existence constrained by new oversight. He retained influence in circles, but the freedom to act unilaterally had been reduced. The spectacle that once defined him had been replaced by a new reality. His actions would be mediated by process. He had not seen that coming when he stepped toward Lena at the altar. He had thought the world would follow image over ledger. He had been wrong. On a late autumn morning, Lena walked into the bakery and sat by the window. A child from the scholarship program entered with a bright folder, acceptance to a nursing program. Lena's eyes found the pendant's small drawer. She reached in, felt its cool metal, and laid it beside the folder. The pendant had started as a small object that drew attention. It had become, by virtue of careful people and patient procedure, a hinge that kept a set of promises intact. There was no final scene of revenge, no gloating tombstone. Instead, there were minutes, an independent audit, reconstituted governance, and a city clinic open for vaccinations. There was a ledger reconciled not by theatrics but by patient scrutiny.
The man who had cheated with the bridesmaid had not known that the woman he chose could, through a handful of documents and the refusal to be bought, halt the easy movement of wealth. He had not known that spectacle can be stopped by signatures and stamps. In the end, Lena tucked the battered notebook into a new folder and placed it in the Trust's public archive. She gave a short speech at a small ceremony for the clinic's reopening. She mentioned Evelyn Kestrel not as myth, but as the author of Practical Generosity, and she asked the community to hold the trustees to account. The crowd cheered, modest applause for a modest victory. The pendant, for the moment, rested in a small box at the bakery, a private thing. The bakery woman, flour on her hands, wrapped a muffin and slipped it to Lena. "You kept the ledger," she said. "You kept what matters." Lena smiled and accepted the pastry as if it were a small benediction. Outside the bakery, the city moved in habitual rhythms: cars, buses, people with parcels. The spectacle that had once stunned the ballroom had been absorbed into a longer story, one about governance, persistence, and the surprising power of small objects when met by steady hands. The case left behind reforms and an admonition. When power prefers light and speed, it often forgets the stubbornness of paper. If the story required a moral, it would be this: documents outlast drama. The woman who had been a courier, who carried parcels and returned them on time, used the same habit she had always had: record, photograph, preserve. And those habits, magnified by careful counsel and tenacious audits, protected programs for people who would otherwise have lost them. She had not sought to end a fortune. She had sought to ensure the fortune served its purpose. In doing so, she had, without malice, curtailed one man's unchecked authority. As she walked home past the clinic with a thermos of tea, Lena thought about vows, literal and civic, and about the peculiar way small objects can change destinies. The city's lights shimmered. The pendant rested in its box at the bakery, no longer a prop for headlines, but an archive entry. She had, by refusing silence and by insisting upon paper's memory, become a steward of what mattered. For anyone watching the arc from altar to audit, the ending was instructive rather than triumphant. A wrong choice at an altar had revealed a fragile truth about power. It can be undone not only by scandal, but by patience, ink, and public-minded custody. The bride had been humiliated. The city had been unsettled. A man had misread a room. But institutions, stubborn and slow, had reasserted themselves. Lena, who had been a courier who delivered ties and packages, had become a person who ensured the continuity of clinics and scholarships. She had not sought glory. She had sought to keep the record straight. If anyone expected a cinematic retribution, they were disappointed. If anyone expected a continuation of spectacle, they watched instead as minutes were signed and audits filed. For those who mattered, the nurse who kept her clinic open, the student who received a scholarship, the child who received a vaccine, the outcome was simple and profound. Money reached its intended purpose. At the edge of the city, in a small room that smelled of yeast and sugar, the bakery woman locked the drawer. The pendant lay within, an object that had changed the story not by glamour, but by being a marker that set processes in motion. Outside, Lena walked home with the soft satisfaction of someone who had learned the calculus of responsibility. She had, in refusing to be bought and in trusting the slow integrity of paper and process, done something that neither the cameras nor the op-eds could easily undo. She had preserved a legacy for people who needed it. If anyone asked later how a single object had become so consequential, the answer would be layered and boring and true. It was not the pendant alone that halted a fortune, but the combination of a woman who kept records, a baker who remembered names, a quiet strategist who knew how to file for preservation, auditors who followed small payments, a notary who kept registry stamps, and a judge who granted a temporary hold. Together, they turned spectacle into stewardship. In the end, Lena placed one final line in the trustee minutes.
This trust exists to serve, not to enrich spectacle. The line was small, plain, and signed. It would be the sort of sentence that, many years hence, a clerk might cite when someone attempted to spin a narrative faster than governance could hold. In the end, Lena placed one final line in the trustee minutes. This trust exists to serve, not to enrich spectacle. The pendant would remain a small relic in a drawer. The clinics and scholarships would keep their lights on. A man who had tried to center himself around spectacle learned, belatedly, that fortunes are not only made of money but of systems, and that systems respond to the patient work of ink and witness. Follow for updates on how the aftermath reshapes the city.